Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Hey friends, welcome back to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, grief psychologist, and today we're talking about a type of grief that doesn't get nearly enough space. Grieving the person you wish they had been. Because here's the truth, not all grief is about missing someone. Sometimes it's about mourning the version of them that never existed, the relationship you wanted but never got, the version of them you hoped for but never saw. Maybe you lost a parent who was never emotionally available. Maybe you had a sibling who was supposed to have your back and never did. Maybe it was a friend, a partner, or someone who in theory should have loved you better than they did. And now they're gone, or the relationship is over, and you're left with grief and also anger, maybe some relief, and 1,000 what ifs. This episode is for the people who are grieving something more complicated than just, I miss them. So let's get into it. What's hard? When everyone expects you to grieve someone in a certain way and your actual emotions, they don't fit in that box. Because we live in a culture that talks about grief as if every loss is about losing someone who is deeply loved and cherished. And sure, sometimes it is. And sometimes we're grieving the version of them we never got to experience in many ways. Losing a parent who was never really there, mourning a sibling who was more of a stranger than a friend, feeling the weight of a relationship that was supposed to be safe and wasn't. And when those people are gone or when the relationship ends, it doesn't erase all the pain they caused. It doesn't make the loss clean. It actually makes it more complicated because now there's no chance for it to ever be different. There's no chance for that repair, that reconciliation. It's gone. And that's its own kind of grief. Because even if a part of you has quote unquote accepted that they were never going to be what you needed, hope is hard to kill. And when death or finality takes away even that tiny sliver of maybe one day, that hurts. And it's okay to grieve that, even if no one else understands it. There's a lot of variables that can impact why relationships are the way they are, why there's estrangement or disconnection, why there was emotional unavailability, or family or friends weren't, or partners weren't safe. Those whys are really tricky here. And when we're in relationship with someone who fits into that box and they die, and the possibility of getting our whys answered is a type of grief. It's tricky, right? I hear this a lot around relationships where there's substance use, and I feel like I've been grieving that person for 10 years. I feel like I've been grieving them my whole life because they chose the substance over me and they couldn't find sobriety, and that impacted our whole family system. And I never got to say the things that I wanted to say or have the type of relationship that I'd hoped for with that person. And it's tricky because it's like part of you is relieved that they're not battling that addiction any longer. And part of you is angry that they couldn't get a handle on it and are angry with the choices that they made, even with understanding that it's a disease. And there's just so much unresolved pain, unresolved questions. And now we've lost the opportunity to figure out how it could have been or what we would have wanted it to be. And so it's more than just missing someone. It's about what you never got to experience. And that's why I'm always really cautious with educating about grief concepts and being intentional with the language choices we use. So not assuming that it was their loved one, waiting for them to use that language so that I know that's true. Because yeah, they might have lost a sibling or a parent or a grandparent or a friend. And that doesn't necessarily mean the default response is loved one. It was their person. And that I'm not meaning like your person in the Grey's Anatomy, Christina Yang and Meredith Grey, you're my person context, but they were your person as in they were someone that you knew. And so I think it's important to be intentional with the language choices we use here and how we label these relationships, because it's not always simple. It's not always a loved one. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. And I think that's important to remember here. As we've talked about, grief isn't just about sadness. And when we're grieving someone who wasn't who they could have been, it's messy, it's sticky, it's tricky, it's complicated. Because maybe you're feeling relief, maybe you're feeling guilt, maybe you feel angry as hell, maybe you feel nothing. And that confuses you. And that's valid. You don't have to love someone to grieve them. You don't even have to like them to grieve them. Our brains and bodies have responses around grief, and sometimes they don't make sense to us. And grief isn't just about what was lost. It's about it's the shoulda, coulda, wouldas. It's about what could have been, what should have been, and what never will be. And that doesn't disappear just because the person is gone. In fact, sometimes that grief gets louder because the emotions are that much more complicated. The thoughts are louder. It's like the volume has been turned up in our brains. So if you've been wrestling with these emotions and wondering, why do I feel this way? I want you to hear this. You are not doing grief wrong. Your grief is valid, even if no one else understands it. One of the hardest things about grieving someone like this or someone who you had a relationship with is there's no real closure. There's no apology coming. There's no maybe someday left on the table. There's no last chance to say, hey, I need something different here in this relationship. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the lack of resolution? So here are 3 strategies to help with processing this type of grief in a way that honors where you are and what the relationship was and what you might need. So 1, the loss for what it is. You do not have to pretend that they were better than they were just because they're gone. You're allowed to grieve the role they should have played. You do not have to pretend they were better than they were just because they're gone. I've got a TV show reference and a movie reference, very different, but I think that they paint this picture. First example, Forrest Gump, when Jenny's dad dies and she goes back to that trailer and just unleashes her rage at how she grew up, what happened to her. She's throwing rocks and dirt and just screaming and crying in anger at the trailer and what that season of life represented for her. I thought that was such a powerful visual to grieve in a way that was honoring where she was at, in the pain, the disappointment that she felt at what had happened to her, what these adults who should have protected her perpetrated and allowed to happen. So I thought that was great. The other example I want to use is from Gilmore Girls. In the recently released 4-episode A Year in the Life spinoff option, Lorelai's dad dies. Spoiler alert, sorry if you haven't seen it yet. Her dad dies, and they show this really big rift between her and her mom. And they go to therapy and try to talk. It's revealed to you the hurt Lorelai called and how her grief showed up and how that impacted her mom. And basically what happened is they're gathered after the celebration of life, and Emily, her mom, asks everyone to go around the little circle. Half of them are intoxicated because they've been drinking at the gathering, and they're sharing a favorite memory of Richard, Lorelai's dad. And when it gets to Lorelai's turn, it's like she either didn't think of anything or, I think she just didn't say. It was awkward, and her mom was really disappointed and hurt that she couldn't just say something nice in that moment of pain when they're grieving, when they were mourning. And it causes this rift between mom and daughter. Lorelai loved her dad, and they had a really complicated relationship. There was misunderstanding, hurts, feeling misrepresented, like feeling unseen, unheard. She had a complicated relationship with her dad. And by the end of the series, she's able to make a repair with her mom and say a memory that was meaningful for her. She was able to trudge through that, but it took time. And I think that was really well depicted, that sometimes we have to work through a lot of the complicated feelings to find a positive memory. And even then we still might not find one, and that gets to be okay too. I think when we're talking about complicated relationships and then that person dying, like, the grief is going to show up in some unique ways. And in Forrest Gump and in the Gilmore Girls situation, they didn't pretend that the person was better than they were just because they were gone. They embraced the pain. I'm going back to Lorelai. She was grieving the role that her dad should have played in her life, could have played in her life if things had been different, if it was a different situation, different circumstance. And so I think taking the time, to the original point, I'm circling back to acknowledging the loss for what it is. Number 2, letting go of the need for an apology. I know this one sucks. And if you never got the validation or the closure that you needed when they were alive, you don't have to spend your energy waiting for it now. There's some really cool narrative therapy techniques that I would encourage you to go with your therapist, some letter writing, some non-dominant handwriting exercises that could be really cool here in starting to creatively, with curiosity, explore what it looks like for that repair, for that meaning making to happen post loss. Because the other thing you can do is validate yourself. Validate that your experience was real, even if they never acknowledged it, even if they couldn't name their role and responsibility in the pain that they caused. You get to do that for yourself. You get to validate your experience because it was real, because your feelings matter. That is your truth. And that gets to take up space. And then 3rd, giving yourself permission to feel all of it. The anger, the sadness, the relief, the resentment, all of it. You don't have to force yourself into just one emotion, because we are complicated creatures and we feel more than one thing at one time. And that's one of the things I love about the Inside Out, the Feelings movie, is at the end, the main character's memories have more than one feeling attached to them because we feel more than one thing. So you get to feel all the sticky, tricky feelings in this situation. And writing it out, talking to someone who gets it, whether it's a therapist, a grief coach, your best friend, your partner, even just sitting with the discomfort instead of pushing it away, it all matters. There's not a perfect way to process through these feelings because they are messy, they are layered, they are heavy. And walking through that emotional molasses is going to take time. And giving yourself permission to not wade through those feelings alone, I think, is going to be really helpful. So, thinking about misperceptions about this kind of grief, I want to take a quick second just to call out something that a lot of people get wrong about this type of grief. Maybe you've heard things like, you should focus on the good times. You should forgive them now that they're gone. They were still your fill in the blank role, parent, sibling, family member, friend. You should be grateful. Listen, no, you don't have to rewrite history just because they're no longer here. You don't have to force forgiveness if that's not where you are. And you definitely don't have to focus on the good times when those good times were few and far between. Your grief is yours, and how you process it, that's up to you, not anyone else. And your therapist or grief coach can help make a safe space for you to process that. Because it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be the glamorized version of what happened because they're no longer here. It is what it is, what happened. And you're trying to find your way through that. So as we wrap up today's episode, gentle reminders: you don't have to deeply love someone to grieve them. Their loss is still felt, and it's okay if it's complicated how you're feeling your way through that. You are allowed to grieve the version of them you needed and never got. So it's okay to grieve that they're no longer physically here, and also grieve that You didn't have the childhood you thought, or the marriage that you thought, or the relationship that you thought. That gets to be okay. Complicated grief is still grief. Your emotions are valid. This is complicated and messy and hard to sit in. And not everyone is going to get it or understand why you're reacting or responding the way that you are. And that's okay. And lastly, you do not have to forgive, minimize, or rewrite history just because they're gone. What happened? It's your truth. It's your lived experience. It gets to take up space. It is valid. You are not crazy. You're not crazy. And most importantly, you are allowed to process this grief in your own way, in your own time. There is definitely not a timeline here. This isn't going to be some pretty light, thoughtful. It's not going to be that. It's okay if it's raw and messy and scary, feeling all those things. If this episode resonated with you, I'd really love to hear if you want to share a story or a takeaway, something that would be helpful. I would love to hear that and make some space for you in your complicated grief space. And if no one has told you lately, you don't have to carry this alone. Remember to be kind to ourselves. This is hard work grieving, and I will see you all next time. Take care. That's it for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If this conversation resonated with you or you think it might benefit someone else, please share it. Sharing can open doors to healing, understanding, and normalizing these griefy conversations. If you're craving deeper insights or ongoing support, consider signing up for the Grief Gap newsletter. It's packed with resources, tips, and personal stories to help you navigate your grief journey. Visit the website www.griefisthenewnormal.com to subscribe. For those who prefer a more personal touch to their healing process, check out my grief journal, Authentically Unapologetic. It's designed to help you explore your grief on your own terms with prompts and exercises that encourage reflection and growth. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and I look forward to our next meaningful conversation. Our soothing tunes are provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in sharing your story, collaborating, or learning more, please email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. You can also stream the episodes on YouTube for more engaging content. Until next time, keep exploring your grief with intention and support, remembering you don't have to do this alone.